So the next speaker is Katherine Timms from Library and Archives Canada. A presentation is on the first draft of the RiC conceptual model. She's going to present her the feedback from the international archival community.
So good morning, and thank you for inviting me to speak about the results of the community consultation on the draft Records in Context conceptual model last year. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. I'm a corresponding member to ICAR, and I'm an archivist librarian who works in standards at Library and Archives Canada. As part of my contribution to this project, I took initiative by offering to help organize the feedback for review, reference, and use by ICAR. So today I'll start by briefly explaining the consultation process and my methods for organizing and analyzing the results. Then I'll share some of the main themes, topics, and issues raised from general points. From general points to more specific ones. My main goal today is to share with you my analysis and interpretation of the comments, highlighting ones of primary concern and giving some concrete examples. So I'm going to act like a journalist, basically reporting on the results, but not providing any kind of conclusion. And this is because ICAR is still working on the comments. And then we'll do some brief conclusions. So the consultation period was about a year ago, and we had really good response by about 62 individuals, groups, and organizations, representing 19 countries and 2 international organizations. Very many comments were submitted. And so sometimes feedback can seem like a double-edged sword. It can be seen good, but there's too much, but really, in this case, it's all good. ICAR really appreciated all of the insightful, detailed, and useful feedback. So this is just to show you all of the countries that participated in the feedback, including people from Italy, and we'd like to thank you very much for your thoughtful contribution. So what did I do with these comments to organize them? I used my own process, breaking them down by theme and topic, sort of following the structure of the draft document, which meant that you lost the context of the original submission, but you could always go back to the original source if you needed to. And this ended up being 6 tables of hundreds of pages of over 1,000 comments, which looks something like this. So we have comment number 152 from table 1, showing who said it, what it was about, and then the quoted comment. So because there were so many comments, it was kind of difficult to work with hundreds of pages of them. So I did another attempt to organize them, summarizing them, consolidating them. Part of the reason for this was also to support the proposed digest strategy, which was the idea that ICAR would communicate to the community some of the issues that had been expressed and some of our ideas to respond to those. So now we have a 55-page document summarizing the comments. And here's comment number 152 again, grouped with other similar comments on this issue. So the good thing about this is you can get a sense of the issues of primary concern. Here there's 14 comments on this issue versus other issues that maybe one person said something. So in my presentation, you'll be seeing graphs based on numbers like these. So they'll all be approximate because it's based on my method of counting, but I'm hoping that they'll show you some trends and patterns in the feedback. So let's start talking about the community's feedback, beginning with the general feedback on the model as a whole. We did receive many positive comments. People liked the idea of moving towards the multi-dimensional approach of the semantic web. But today I'm going to talk about all of the problems, because that's what ICAR will be using to revise the model. We want to address those issues. So here's some of the general issues raised about the draft. First, it wasn't clear if RiC was intended to function as an overarching model or as a schema, or both. The scope of the model and the intended audience weren't always clear either. Was it to also help with custodial management? Did it provide enough coverage to different parts of the record continuum, such as upstream records management? And all of the focus on the business area of records made it seem that maybe you couldn't use it for personal papers. Some people also felt that the underlying principles, including provenance, weren't fully explained, and that other principles relevant to description, like accountability and transparency, were missing. Many people asked for more information on the design principles, the rationales for modeling choices, whether existing ontologies have been considered or could be used, and about the fate of the existing ICA standards. Some were concerned that RiC didn't seem to address user-contributed description, and it wasn't clear how RiC descriptions would actually help improve access for users. Some felt that digital records weren't adequately addressed, such as not being detailed enough, not showing the difference between information, representation, and carrier, and not explaining the technological context of records. On the other hand, some people said there was too much attention on digital at the expense of analog. Another issue was about interoperability, and many people wanted to see a stronger connection to records management. There were a lot of comments about the presentation, that it was incomplete. We had missing definitions, confusing terminology, and not explaining which elements were mandatory. Other people were concerned about how to actually use it, and they asked for tools, crosswalks, and training. And people were curious about the development process, thinking that it wasn't very transparent. They wanted to know about the EGAD membership. They wanted more communication and more information about project timelines and translation plans. So this is just a visual summary of the issues I just mentioned. And the intent of this is to highlight for you what the most prominent issues were in general. And you can see that they're modeling concerns in yellow, presentation issues in brown, and questions around transitioning to RiC in gray. And the numbers in brackets are my counts of the comments. So now that we've talked about the general feedback about the model as a whole, let's start looking at comments about specific components of RiC, starting with the entities, or the main things being described in the model. So I'm going to give a fair bit of detail here, because the entities are arguably the fundamental building blocks of the model. When you build a model, you start with the entities. So some general feedback here. There was a lot of questions about the choice of entities. And some people had suggestions for changing something from an entity to a property, or the other way around. Modeling something as an entity allows you to make statements about it. And in some cases, there was a gap. People wanted to make statements about something, but they couldn't because it wasn't an entity, or, again, the other way around. We had lots of suggestions for new entities, and this graph summarizes them for you. And you can see that there was comparatively a fair amount of interest in having a relation or event entity. These are the two bars at the top. The third bar down is name, and people suggested having name as an entity instead of a property, because sometimes you have different versions of names and you want to be able to relate them together. It wasn't clear how to do that if name was a property. And we had all kinds of other suggestions, like having entities for content, carrier, and storage to give more focus. And sometimes only one person suggested an entity that would be important for them in their context, something like performance role for dramatic archives. So we had comments also suggesting organizing our entities instead of having the flat list. So primary and secondary, or having one super entity thing under which all others would be sub-entities. And this would allow you to do things like inherit properties or share properties. And also to focus on the core record-keeping entities to make them different from secondary ones. And again, you could have a hierarchical structure. So moving on from the general feedback, let's look at feedback on specific RiC entities. Starting with our record-related entities. So we have the record component, or the parts, record set, and documentary form. And generally here, there was positive feedback on record component, and record set, although some people said, why not just have one entity, whether it's aggregate or item, given the fact that the distinctions between the three might not always be clear, particularly with respect to digital records. On the other hand, many people said record set was a good thing because it allows you to identify aggregations in a more flexible way. And for documentary form, some felt it might be better as a property, not as an entity. So this is a visual summary of the main issues about this group of entities. And you can see that a large number of comments concerned issues of overlap or lack of clarity between the record-related entities. So the boundaries were unclear, and this is up to the yellow bar in the middle. So a similar number of comments focused on problems of definitions for all these entities. The definitions weren't clear, and this is from the green bar to the end. And comments saying that the definitions aren't clear were really common, and I think they're really important because it's our job to try to communicate as clearly as possible what the things are that we're trying to describe. Moving on from record entities, we have our agent-related entities of agent, occupation, and position. Feedback here for agent was to model subtypes so that you can identify distinct properties for each sub-entity. For occupation position, it wasn't really clear how they were distinct from some business entities. And they also seemed to focus too much on business, and again, what about private papers or manuscripts? So in this summary here, you can see that modeling issues for the agent entities, including addressing the apparent overlap between them, was most often commented upon. So this goes up to the green bar in the middle. And again, the second largest portion of comments concerned the definitions. So from the medium blue bar to the end. Moving on to the business entities of function, activity, function abstract, and mandate. Again, there were concerns about overlap among these, particularly between function and activity, questioning whether people would be able to practically and consistently devise a method for distinguishing among and using them. The need for function abstract was questioned, or put another way, why just function in the abstract? Why not also activity in the abstract? Some asked about functional provenance, which wasn't explicitly detailed in the document, and whether the entity mandate would be practical to use. So in this summary, you can see that the majority of comments were about the overlap between the business entities. And this is the giant blue bar. And again, there were many concerns about the definitions of each of these. So the rest, the other half of the bar there. So the last grouping of RiC entities are those that RiC shares with other sibling heritage communities, date, place, and concept thing. And there were a lot of questions around date, particularly because it was modeled as an entity and as a property of relations. Most people thought it should just be a property of all entities. For place, people wanted a clearer distinction between jurisdictions and geographic places, as well as having questions about the overlap between place and agent. For example, when a corporate body could also seem like a place or like an archival repository. And for concept thing, there was concern about overlap with the other entities because it was scoped to include all of them. And there was a fear that people would use it for everything if they didn't really understand the other entities, if everything wasn't clearly explained. So in this summary here, you can see that most of the comments in this area were about date. People were really concerned about date, its modeling, its definition, and how to actually implement it. This is the blue bar, up to the blue bar in the middle. And for place and concept thing, most comments were about modeling, definitions, and implementation issues as well. So in addition to being entities, date and place were also properties of relations, and this caused some concern. Another concern here was that additional shared properties might be needed, and this points to comments about the control information or description about description being missing from this draft of RiC. So if all descriptive triples are statements, they're being stated by someone with a certain degree of certainty, possibly referring to a source at a given time and place, and this assertion might be in an order or sequence in relation to other assertions. So these are things that we might consider in the revision. So we've talked about all of the RiC entities and the feedback, and we can move on to talking about feedback on some of the RiC properties now. And properties are the pieces of information that you can record about the entities. There are really too many to list here, but essentially there are properties available for use with all entities, and then properties specific to each entity in RiC. The grand total of 97, but within the 97, there are some properties that occur more than once. So more than one entity has a history property or a description property, for example. So for the general feedback about RiC properties, some mentioned that the obligation, so mandatory or optional, wasn't included and they wanted that information. They also wanted to know if properties were repeatable. Some people suggested improving the presentation of the properties. So when a property occurred more than once, like history or description, define it once and then say it can be used with this entity or this entity. Some people felt that data types, so control vocabulary or free text, didn't belong at the level of a conceptual model, perhaps better in the ontology or implementation guidance. On the other hand, some people said, you didn't give us enough information about data types. Don't leave it for implementation guidance or the ontology. And this is something that happened sometimes anyways. You had two completely conflicting points of view. And so it's our job to figure out what to do with that. Or try to figure out what to do with that. We also had lots of suggestions for new properties. For record, some people asked for more information about the record's lifecycle management activities, like disposal, appraisal, registration. There was nothing specifically about this in the first draft. For agent, there were suggestions for more demographic characteristics or aspects of identity, like ethnicity, religious affiliation, and race. And lastly, people suggested defining a type property for use with relations. So although relation wasn't really described as an entity in the draft, there were two properties you could use to describe them, like I mentioned, date and place. So the idea behind the type property here is that you could use it to organize the relations, to help improve semantic clarity, so you could group relations that were similar together, so that when people went to implement this, there would be more consistency. It would be clear what the meaning was. So these are some, in addition to new properties, we also had a fair amount of comments on specific issues to do with properties, which I'll share two with you today. The first is a rather important one. was all through the draft, questions and comments about digital records. The main issue raised was that people felt RiC didn't have enough detail to really accommodate digital records and digital record keeping. So with respect to properties, people noted that some properties, some existing ones, needed clarification. For example, encoding format for record, which could be character encoding, file format, MIME type, AV codecs. It wasn't clear what it could be. And then some people asked for more properties, for the more detailed information. One that was mentioned a few times was properties for fixity information. There was an authenticity and integrity note, but it was a free text property. So people asked, that doesn't seem like a good choice to put my checksum in a free text field, but there didn't seem to be anywhere else for it. Other people pointed out that describing systems contexts and dependencies between aspects like application software, operating systems, and hardware, that these were important, but missing from RiC. And people wanted to see more digital examples, more digital documentary forms, to help it make it more clear how certain properties would apply to digital records. A completely different issue had to do with agent identity and gender. So for a person agent, we had a lot of feedback around these issues. Some people felt that the archivist would not be in a position to determine whether an identity was true or fictitious, and that distinguishing between the given and assumed name wasn't very useful. The complexity of gender was missing in the draft RiC. And again, maybe it's not the place of the archivist to determine someone's gender. Why gender and not other characteristics? What if gender changes over time? And is it really useful information for users? So these are some of the comments on the properties, and now we can move to the final piece of the model, which is the relations. And relations in RiC are the types of associations or relationships that you can designate between two entities. And this part of RiC is lengthy, as relations are presented twice for each domain entity. So for example, you have record was created by agent and agent created record, both in the list. Relations between RiC entities can be anything from a general association relationship to provenance relationship, subject relationship, and there's many other kinds. So this graph shows the main issues raised, and I grouped them to highlight the prevalence of issues around the presentation of RiC relations in the draft, which was the area of concern most commented upon. So they're from the green bar at the top to the green bar in the middle. It's all about presentation. So to start, many felt that presenting a particular relation in both present and past tense was a concern. So having both agent owns record and agent owned record. So this actually received the most comments. As you can see, it's the green bar at the top. Some felt that you don't need to state both tenses, that this created a potentially unmanageable amount of work to maintain relations as they change over time. Instead, you could assign date information to describe a relation. So you could assign a date range to agent-owned record to indicate when it was true. A different suggestion around presentation was to consider organizing or grouping them. And this refers back to the type property idea that I mentioned before. So you could group associative relations, contextual relations, structural relations to make the presentation clearer. And about having both agent created record and record was created by agent, some people felt that wasn't necessary. It made the list too long. It made it difficult to see where the semantically unique relations were. And some also felt that you don't need to present the inverse if you can infer it. So if one is true, then the other is true. So you don't need to say both. And lastly, for presentation, the lack of definitions and examples made it difficult to understand what they were actually about. So in addition to presentation issues, some felt that RiC relations were very comprehensive, very long list, yet still incomplete. So some people felt that certain important relations were missing. This is the green bar in the middle. Some asked whether all relations had to be binary, so between only two entities. What about in cases where you have a relation between more than two? And this is the blue bar directly below the last. And otherwise, the issues around relations concerned interoperability, reuse from other ontologies, and implementation concerns. So some of the main messages in the general feedback on RiC relations are that RiC should contain key relations presented in an efficient way, that there might be ways to group or cluster relations, and that there needs to be a strategy for managing the time-bound nature of relations, as some may exist only in the past, or some might change over time. In addition to these general issues, commenters provided a variety of detailed or nuanced questions about adding new relations or limitations implied by current gaps, and conceptual overlap between existing relations, which is in part due to the lack of definitions and examples in the draft. So I'll just give two quick examples of specific issues on relations. For digital records, our friend again, some recommended modifications to the model to allow for relating different manifestations of records, so having analog records and their digitized counterparts, or different renditions of digital records made for access and preservation reasons. And a completely different issue regarding the relation is associated with, some wondered if it was too basic to be meaningful, or maybe if it should be defined as a primary relation type up here, with all other types being sub-relations or specializations of it. So we've made it through all of the feedback now. A little bit of visual relief for you before we move on. So what can one conclude from all of these comments? And what are the next steps for the RiC conceptual model? So in my opinion, the feedback shows that the archival community is interested in EGAD's work to develop a conceptual model for archival description and is generally supportive of it. That the thoughtful consideration of the draft resulted in detailed, insightful, and useful feedback, and the comments will help improve the draft, and they represent a substantial contribution to guiding the revision. The comments demonstrate that the community wants something of high quality that is useful and implementable. And lastly, the comments show that the community would like to better understand the development process and have the opportunity to actively contribute to it via continued consultation, discussion, and feedback. So I know Daniel talked a bit about next steps. So just to highlight the feedback, though, that it is guiding our revision of the model. And I mentioned earlier the digest strategy, so we could post some responses to some of these main issues in the feedback. And that our goal is to have an update on that strategy soon, as well as the next version of the conceptual model in early 2018. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kat, for the presentation of the feedback, which seems to be a very interesting opportunity for us, but also for our colleagues to understand a little bit how the RiC-CM was discussed and sometimes appreciated, sometimes criticized, but always with, as you said, very interested and with the intention to help the development of the conceptual model. Ora possiamo fare una piccola sosta di una decina di minuti little break of 10 minutes to give the possibility of change with the computer, I think, something like that. So, ci vediamo veramente fra 10 minuti, comunque abbiamo ancora